Hello, my name is Bill Holstein, and I'm president of the Overseas Press Club Foundation. What extraordinary times we're living through. This is the second year we've elected to go virtual with our presentation because of the obvious uncertainties surrounding the pandemic. We are grateful to all of you today for watching and to our sponsors who have demonstrated their commitment to our cause and indeed their loyalty to our cause. Our patrons include Bloomberg, Mercedes-Benz, the estate of Rosalind Massow, who we've missed very much, Reuters, Toyota Motor North America, the Wall Street Journal, and our friends include the Associated Press, the Pamela Howard Family Foundation, Quest Diagnostics, and William Ruckhiser, who's also a member of our board. The pandemic has also created enormous challenges in terms of launching the careers of our winners. News organizations simply have not been operating their bureaus in the way they once did. But as you will find out in the next few minutes, we've been able to identify a group of exceptionally talented young winners, 17 of them, and they are finding their way into our beloved foundation, our beloved profession, one way or another. You also hear how our winners from recent years have been covering the conflict in and around Ukraine. It's an incredible validation of the foundation's efforts. We encourage you to read more about all the participants in today's program and about the OPC program, about the OPC Foundation in the program you received along with your Zoom invitation. And now let's get right to it and meet this year's winners.
It was at a very young age that I started to ask questions. I was 7 years old and had just moved halfway across the world from Baltimore, where I was born, to Wuhan, China, where I attended a local kindergarten. I was quickly thrown into a language and culture much different from the one I had left, and I was always asking questions. Since then, my curiosity about the world has never gone away. I later returned to China for 3rd and 8th grade, beginning to ask more nuanced questions as I got older. And in this way, I think I can truly trace my interest in journalism to a very young age. Still, asking questions is my favorite part of reporting, and getting to chase my curiosities as a career is something I consider a real privilege. I think the most impactful reporting project I've worked on to date was one published in the Washington Post. I worked on a team of students to profile 51 nursing home residents, one from each state, who had passed away due to COVID-19. I sat for hours on the phone with friends and family members, listening to stories, laughing at memories, learning to ask detailed questions in a sensitive way, determined to gain a genuine understanding of who they were. I loved that project because I was genuinely curious about the people whose lives I was putting into words. I wasn't just listening to memories because I had to. I genuinely wanted to know. And that's how I approach all of my work. I follow my curiosity everywhere I go and in everything I do. Next, I hope to return to East Asia, and to China in particular, where many of my most burning curiosities lie. I'm so grateful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for giving me the support necessary to do so. Thank you so much.
Two years ago, I did a story on a Hong Kong journalist who relocated to Taiwan after the turmoil in Hong Kong. It was devastating hearing him talking about how the Hong Kong media landscape was no longer the same as it was before. He told me Hong Kong journalists were fleeing home and many had come to Taiwan. That story touched upon the East Asian regional conflicts I grew up with as a Taiwanese. Most recently, in the hope of leveraging greater impact as a business journalist from a diversified background, I did a profile story on the NFT artist Emily Yang. That story was for CoinDesk, a cryptocurrency and blockchain publication I currently intern at. Emily is a 27-year-old girl who originally came from Taiwan. She sold an NFT art piece for $500,000 in 2020. And ever since that, she had been contributing most of her art proceeds to causes like AAPI empowerment and the freedom of the press. I hope to work on more stories like this that speak up for a minority I myself belong to. Looking forward, I hope to work with the Overseas Press Club to cover the uncovered and to provide my own unique perspectives to newsrooms that want diversified voices. Thank you for your time.
My interest in reporting abroad started right in my hometown of Burlington, Vermont. An artist was planning to lay thousands of small, handleless cups on the ground and to fill them with Bosnian coffee. The cups were supposed to represent the lives of the men and boys who were killed in the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. As the reporting intern at my local paper, it was my job to write a story about the artist and her installation. At that point, I knew very little about the Bosnian Civil War, but I felt like I should have known more. Over the past few decades, Vermont has welcomed thousands of refugees from all around the world, including Bosnia, and the majority of them have settled in my county. But it wasn't until that summer, as I spoke to local Bosnians about the war and the ritual of pouring coffee, that I became more keenly aware of all the stories surrounding me from all around the world that I knew so little about. These stories should be part of our collective consciousness because in America, we're from everywhere, and we should strive to know one another more deeply. As a foreign correspondent, it would be such a privilege to bring some of these stories back home, a privilege that I would handle with care. Thank you so much for this scholarship.
My thumb protruding from my fist, I stood tall by the dirt road, thousands of miles away from my home in the UK. I was in a small Cambodian town, about a 7-hour drive from Bangkok, where I hoped to reach by sundown. Before long, a car pulled over. The windows rolled down, revealing 2 warm faces searching mine. We communicated with hand signals and facial expressions. I don't speak Khmer, and they didn't speak English, but to my disbelief, they were traveling to Bangkok and invited me along for the ride. My first successful hitchhiking pickup in what would become a 6-month solo trip. 3.5 years later, the curiosity that led me on that adventure has led me to want to pursue a career in international journalism. Whether writing about a cafe in Myanmar, hoping to provide economic opportunity to young people amid COVID and coups, or a team of volunteers patrolling the British coastline in an effort to stop suicides and save lives, I aim to illuminate big policy questions through intimate stories. When I was zigzagging my way through Southeast Asia, armed only with a backpack and a piece of cardboard scrawled with the name of my next destination, I savored my hitchhiking conversations. Waiting at the side of the road, I met people I wouldn't have otherwise. The role of the foreign correspondent is to translate one culture to another. With the generous support of the Overseas Press Club Foundation, it is work I'm honored to undertake.
One rainy afternoon in Jordan, I found myself driving through the countryside, headed to a refugee camp to interview mothers about hydroponic technology. I didn't know any journalists in Jordan or have connections to a news outlet, but I knew I had a story that had to be told. The women, all refugees from Gaza, had no citizenship and thus no work. But thanks to this new technology, they had water in one of the water-poorest countries in the world. Since that first visit, I've connected with more entrepreneurs and startups across Jordan who are working to bring water to the most marginalized of communities. I grew up in a small California town dominated by almond farming and the dairy industry, and never thought I'd find myself living in Amman, Jordan, with a local family speaking Arabic for 4 months. But then again, I've always been drawn to the Middle East intersection of languages, religions, and cultures. I was in high school at the height of the Syrian civil war and watched as Syrian families moved to my town. One of my first assignments as a student journalist was to go to the home of one family, interviewing high schoolers and their parents about their long, arduous journey from Aleppo to California. I want to tell stories through my words and my documentary work that change the way people see the world. I want to take them to places they'll never visit themselves. I have so much more to learn as I begin my career in foreign correspondence, and I can't thank the Overseas Press Club Foundation enough for opening this door as I graduate college and begin life as a full-time reporter.
Seven years ago, I traveled to Honduras and Guatemala to investigate reports of human rights abuses by Canadian mining companies. I was the first international journalist to visit the world's third largest silver mine, the site where 20 protesters had been shot at by the mine's private security. I believed being on the ground was critical to understanding what had happened, but in place of answers, I found competing narratives and ambiguity. I learned that Canadian companies aren't typically held to Canadian standards abroad, and that the strength of victims' voices can be distorted by weaknesses in their country's judicial system. The fight is often unfair, and the resource disparities enormous. It took more than 6 years, $1 billion acquisition, and a lawsuit that touched 3 levels of court for a group of impoverished farmers to receive a formal apology. This story has been important to me and has inspired me to pursue more hard-hitting business journalism and to investigate how multinational corporations are held accountable internationally. Foreign correspondence is absolutely necessary to understand how people in underreported areas are impacted by organizations making decisions thousands of miles away. This award will support my return to Central America to report on Canadian mining companies' controversial legacy in the region. I'm very thankful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for this opportunity.
My fledgling journalism career has been a whirlwind of exhilaration, sweat, and tears all across the world. I spent 2 months in an asylum camp in Matamoros, Mexico, at the border with Brownsville, Texas. I interviewed asylum seekers escaping violence in the Northern Triangle and heard a speech by now First Lady Jill Biden, where she condemned the policy that left the people languishing in that camp as cruel. But it was a policy that was ultimately reintroduced under her husband's presidency. I've traveled in a rickety Jeep deep into the Thar Desert on the Pakistan-India border. I saw Western-educated entrepreneurs from Karachi and Lahore and Islamabad racing to go out into the desert to forge new ventures with remote goat herders. I witnessed a slice of a broader movement in the country to break down an entrenched urban-rural divide and transform Pakistan's economy into a digital century by tapping into those communities that had long been forgotten. I wrote about this story for my OPC Fellowship Award essay. And my journalism career has taken me to the Polish-Belarusian border, where I met brave migrants trapped between a cynical Belarusian dictatorship and a broken European asylum policy. I myself was even harassed by Polish border guards who confused my brown skin for that of a migrant or a smuggler. I had the opportunity to interview both a Lithuanian prime minister and other European leaders, and a gentleman from Iraq who was the victim of policies written in Brussels and in Minsk. I have an immense passion to continue traveling the world, to hear the voices that are often made silenced or made invisible, and to uplift those stories that often go untold. I'm so grateful the OPC Foundation took a chance on me with this award and given me the opportunity to pursue a career that allows me to do just that.
I love stories with real-world impact, and you can't get more real than trash. Last summer, I reported a story from the Czech Republic out of Prague's largest trash dump. I was there to document not the problem, the city's skyrocketing waste level, but a solution. A new circular economy was taking root in the city, fueled by the daily participation of average residents on a government-backed app. Technology is profoundly altering how citizens across the globe interact with business and politics. I aim to document this change and its impact while keeping humanity at the center of each story. I'm excited to grow as an international investigative technology and design correspondent with support from the Overseas Press Club Foundation. Thank you for supporting young correspondents like me.
For as long as I can remember, I've had a soft spot for the weird stories. A lot of that can probably be traced back to my childhood obsession with Anthony Bourdain's No Reservations. For a kid growing up in the endless expanse of Houston's suburbs, Bourdain's show was an escape, a tantalizing glimpse at a future in which I could travel and meet interesting people all over the world. And through journalism, I've been lucky enough to have many adventures, and then I decided to go to grad school to study business and economics reporting. An unlikely choice, maybe, for somebody who loves the strange stories above all else. But here's the secret. Money is strange, and it underpins everything we do. And there are so many weird stories waiting to be told about the world of international business. The rise of crypto is one of the most interesting stories in the business world today. I've taken a deep dive into the world of crypto and am now working as a full-time reporter at CoinDesk. With the generous grant from the Overseas Press Club Foundation, I'm planning to go to South Korea and do a feature story on the country's rapidly developing crypto industry, how it's being regulated, how it's impacting culture, and how it's being received by South Koreans, many of whom have turned to crypto as a way to escape stagnating economic mobility and mounting household debt. Thank you all for supporting young correspondents like me. I look forward to the chance to grow as an international business reporter and to continue to shine a spotlight on the stories that are strange and unusual. Thanks so much.
I grew up in a city in the south of India that is known for its silk textiles and rich coffee. It's also known to have faced a devastating tsunami and several floods in the past. As I grew up there, I found myself wondering, what was the impact of those events and how far did it reach? Those are questions I continue to ask myself now, on my journey of becoming a foreign correspondent. In early 2020, I worked at CNBC's Asia Pacific headquarters in Singapore. I was at the newsroom when Brexit was formalized and when a suspected case of flu blew up into a global pandemic. I didn't realize then that some of those events could dictate how businesses and economies would shape up for years to come. What I did observe, however, was the profound human impact of some of those events, no matter which part of the world they originated from. Journalism is my way of finding answers for the tough questions. Questions that not only need answering for the corporate world, but also for the average person next door. For the Overseas Press Club Award, I wrote about India's vast diamond industry that is so deeply entrenched in tradition and legacy. Diamonds are seen as the purest form of wealth in Indian families, and more recently, this industry has been disrupted by lab-grown diamonds. This story covers the cusp of demographic, social, and economic trends that India is facing as we speak. I hope that with this scholarship, I can explore business and economic stories from a human perspective. My goal is to cover Asian economies, which are often not seen as the center of momentum in business reporting. Thank you so much for this honor, and I hope to make the most of this opportunity.
If there's one thing I strive to do best as a journalist, is to listen to the voices of my subjects when telling their stories. The continuous self-evaluations have taken me on a path of educating myself on communities and issues that has allowed me to touch on stories that are underreported but speak to a bigger audience. Recently, as a BBC reporter covering important issues across Africa, I have attempted to fill this gap by pitching, producing, and publishing important stories. That's why I'm grateful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for giving me the opportunity to expand a story I covered in Kibra, Africa's largest urban slum. I'll be heading to Senegal to uplift the voices of women who have been forced to resort to infanticide, just like the ones in my piece in Kibra. I hope to do what I do best, listen and tell their stories in their own authentic voices using my correspondent skills.
During a trip I made to West Africa in 2019, I visited a coastal town called Dakhla. The settlement sits on a peninsula that juts into the Atlantic Ocean and is nearly 600 kilometres south of the Moroccan border in a disputed territory known as Western Sahara. Since Spanish colonists left the region in 1975, a war has raged between the Polisario Front, a nationalist group pursuing independence for the local Sahrawi people, and Morocco, which is seeking to make the region its own. As I moved south through Western Sahara, the terrain shifted from the rocky brown of the Atlas Mountains into the pale yellow sands of the Sahara. Eventually, I reached Dakhla. Despite being in the middle of the desert, it had become a kitesurfing destination for young Moroccans. Bright kites floated above the beaches, and in trendy restaurants, people sat drinking beers and cocktails. After speaking with local shopkeepers, I learnt more about the sinister history of Dakhla. In the last decade, Morocco has been trying to establish Dakhla as one of its outposts, providing the country with strategic access to the Atlantic coast. Local Sahrawis have had their houses and shops burnt to the ground in the process. When I returned to the UK and Googled Dakhla, I was shocked to see how scant coverage of the conflict had been. This convinced me that there is a market for reporting on the sorts of issues that interest me most. I'm grateful to the Overseas Press Club for awarding me this fellowship and look forward to returning to West Africa. There, I would like to report on the Sahrawi struggle for independence, but also gain a broader familiarity with the region, to identify new stories, and to embark on a career as a foreign correspondent.
I was born in Seoul, South Korea, while my family is originally from a small city in the Southwest. During my time in the US, I've lived in Kansas City, Michigan, New Jersey, and now New York. Every place I've been to has misgivings about the others and claims to have different ideals. I realized that when people ask me where I'm from, they want a simple answer, one that allows them to easily categorize me in their minds. I want to become a foreign correspondent and have my experiences of having one foot in, one foot out of all the places I've been to inform the reporting that I do. I want to be the one to ask questions and expand people's understandings of what globalization, migrations, and policies mean for us. And most of all, I want to highlight the shared humanity and complexities of what these experiences mean for everyone. I'm grateful for the support from OPC, and I'm excited to continue with these goals with the help of my fellowship this summer. Thank you.
I spent my first day reporting for what would become a 9-month-long team project 5 blocks away from my apartment in New York City, sitting at a conference table with 2 co-reporters and 6 local trans activists and sex workers from Central and South America. It was an informational interview. They told us in Spanish about where journalists had failed them before and what they wanted to see more of. They also gave us a recommendation. Go home and watch the show La Neno on Netflix, a story about a trans sex worker that really got it right. So, of course, I spent that night binge watching that show. It's really well done and includes some pretty biting commentary. In one of the first scenes, a group of trans sex workers, fed up with the media's perpetual voyeurism, pull a gun on a reporter. Now, I was quite startled. My first thought was, are they trying to send a message? But instead of being deterred, we doubled down on our research and on our intentionality. We spent months building trust, attending community events, and above all, listening to diverse perspectives on the intersection of migration and sex work. Ultimately, we honed in on the story of one sex worker, starting from her childhood in Mexico to her migration to New York, to ICE detention and deportation, and then back again to New York, where now in her 40s, she's been trying to retire from sex work and embark on a new career as an Uber Eats driver. In the end, it was a deeply nuanced story that we could be proud of and that I think the community felt served by, and that's the kind of work I'm excited to do more of in the future, thanks to the support of the Overseas Press Club Foundation.
It's 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in 2018, and I'm riding on the back of this little Honda motorcycle taxi, weaving around potholes in the Kenyan town of Kisumu. Now, there are 3 people on this street bike. There's the driver at the front, my colleague and Ugandan journalist Frederick Musisi in the middle, using his arms as makeshift turn signals, and me, holding on for dear life at the tail, acting as both counterweight and pack mule. I was in Kenya to report on the distribution of climate aid in rural East Africa for Freelance Project. Frederick and I were on our way to interview some NGO officials the following morning about how they would use that aid. This was my second reporting trip to East Africa, having interned in 2017 for the Daily Monitor, a Ugandan newspaper. But now, a year later, I was so excited to return to East Africa with a grant to report on environmental issues, subjects I care deeply about. But as our Honda sped along the street, partially illuminated by sparse and yellowy street lamps, noses filling with the mix of diesel, late-night barbecue, and that ubiquitous red clay soil, our mission really began to crystallize my mind. Never before had a sense of purpose and passion and adventure so perfectly melded. I remember thinking to myself clearly in this moment, this is it. This is what you're meant to do. Now, journalism gives me that sense of purpose, but foreign correspondence gives me that passion, along with the understanding that my profession is right and challenging and worthy, and that at the bottom of my heart, I love what I do. So I want to thank the Overseas Press Club Foundation for providing the means and guidance to continue this journey, wherever it leads me.
I'd only just returned to my desk when the explosion hit. I was immediately launched from my chair under a shower of glass before the ceiling collapsed around me. Only a few blocks from Beirut's port, our newsroom had taken a direct hit, and I spent the night reporting from street corners before finally passing out in my apartment stairwell at 4 a.m. I think a lot about what drove me to be there that day. Growing up in inner city South London, I had every opportunity to be led astray like so many of those around me. However, I was always curious about the world around me from an early age. I vividly remember coming home from school one day to see pictures of the 2011 Arab Spring unfolding on TV. It made me realise that the world was a bigger place than my humble doorstep and has driven me as a journalist to understand it ever since. I first visited Lebanon in the summer of 2018 to study Arabic. Although a pitiful cliche, it didn't take long for me to fall in love with the country, and I soon realised that this is where I wanted to begin my career as a foreign correspondent. In the years since, I've reported from revolution squares to prison cells and squalid refugee camps. It has been a baptism of fire, but one which I've sunk my teeth into and grown from at every opportunity. I developed a particular interest in the plight of the some 250,000 migrant domestic workers in the country, most of whom were now trapped as Lebanon's economy collapsed. As part of this, I began to investigate how Facebook buy and sell groups were being used to traffic migrant workers against their will, and ultimately ended up building on this for my OPC story. In June, I will be joining the New York Times as their new international reporting fellow. I'm excited for this new challenge and hope to use the OPC funds afterwards to travel back to the Middle East and continue to investigate human trafficking networks in the region. Thank you so much for the Overseas Press Club for this opportunity, and I look forward to meeting you all in person.
I gripped my steering wheel with white knuckles as I drove through a never-ending sea of orange bushfire smoke. It was the middle of Australia's apocalyptic 2020 fire season, and I had just arrived in the country. I couldn't breathe, but I couldn't tell if it was the smoke or the fact that I was careening down a high-speed 2-lane dirt road, and it was my first time driving on the left side of the road with the steering wheel on the right side of the car. I was there to make a film, in partnership with a rural community that had already been decimated by the fires, but where the fires were no longer raging. Rather, this fire-affected community was dealing with a whole host of other issues in the aftermath. No cell service in 90% of the region, no infrastructure, an explosive mental health crisis. On top of that, in the area there was dangerous flooding, from torrential rains that swept through right after the fires. The water washed out bridges and left people already without homes, stranded on their properties, unable to access food, water, internet, and shelter. I established deep trust with people in the town and lived there for 6 months, reporting on the compounding, complex, and seemingly never-ending fallout of the fires. I was no stranger to climate coverage, but it took this experience for the true stakes of climate change to hit home for me. In that town, I decided that I wanted to keep doing this type of video storytelling forever. With the support of OPC, I feel confident in my mission moving forward as a visual journalist to continue telling nuanced stories internationally. Thank you.
As I say every year, these young people are far smarter and more experienced than I was when I first became a correspondent in Hong Kong for United Press International. I won't tell you what year that was, but they are impressive in their commitment and in their dedication. Now for something else truly special, John Daniszewski and I had a series of fascinating conversations with 3 of our past winners. They are Uliana Pavlova, Max Seddon, and Valerie Hopkins. Here are their stories. Ladies and gentlemen, we felt it would be interesting and appropriate to share some conversations that I and John Daniszewski, Vice President of the Board and Vice President of the Associated Press, have had with some of our recent winners. And we're starting with Uliana Pavlova, who won in 2017 And now it's 5 years later, and she is a seasoned war correspondent. But before we get into Ukraine and Russia, tell us about your path from after you won. You had a number of internships and you worked for the Moscow Times. So how did you put together your career path?
Right. Well, thank you for inviting me. First of all, it's always a pleasure to talk. So I was a recipient in 2017, and I believe after that, I won an award for a story I actually did during one of my first internship of Political Europe in Brussels. And after that, I believe I did an internship with Bloomberg in Chicago, and then another one with CNN in Washington, D.C. And following that, I actually stayed in Washington, D.C. for another year and a half. And I worked as a junior reporter at this company called MLEX. I was doing policy reporting. So it didn't actually have to do anything with international news, but because I was Russian, I always had this goal to come back to Russia and cover Russia for the Western audiences. So in 2020, the pandemic started, and it just worked out this way that my visa was also ending and I had no way to renew it. So it seemed like a perfect time to fulfill my wish. And I went back to Russia. I moved to Moscow. I'm not originally from Moscow, so I didn't actually have any connections in Moscow per se, but I freelanced a little bit for Bloomberg Tax, and then I ended up being hired as a news reporter for the Moscow Times. And I worked there for a year. Mm-hmm. And then I went freelancing, and I started freelancing for several outlets in Moscow, including CNN, but also I was producing for CNN and Sky News, and also writing for the Associated Press and the Telegraph. It's a British newspaper. And I also did a few magazine stories for Political Magazine.
So how did you end up covering Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine?
Well, I'm also Russian-Ukrainian. My mother is from Western Ukraine, and growing up, I actually spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I speak Russian and Ukrainian. Unfortunately, right now, I'm not able to go to Ukraine because I do have a Russian passport. But when the war started, I was actually at the border of Russia and Ukraine. And I was covering the war from the Russian side, which is actually interesting because I don't think there were a lot of people covering it from the Russian side just when it started. But it was a surreal experience because me and my team, we arrived to Belgorod at 5 a.m. on February 24th. And just at 5 a.m. on February 24th, the war started, and we could hear the jets flying. And then, the next thing you see the missiles in the sky. And Belgorod is a small military town. We had to go through several checks on the way there, which I also thought was a little bit weird. Because I think in a normal scenario, you wouldn't be stopped by border police so often. And, it is funny because it's not funny, but now thinking of it, we were driving to Belgorod and we got stopped by border security, and they checked our passports. They're like, "Oh, are you going to cover the war?" And it seemed like it was people already knew it was going to happen.
I was just wondering, because you're Russian-Ukrainian background, do you feel any sense of being pulled in different directions when you cover this conflict?
Definitely. And that's something I actually did want to talk about because at some point I began to envy my colleagues who were just foreign correspondents and people who were covering this from a more distanced perspective, when it felt like I was covering the story that was also happening to me. And, the day the war started, my relatives started calling me And, I had relatives from Ukraine who called me and they were like, we can hear jets flying overhead. And, just it was a very stressful time because we didn't really know what would happen next. I find myself relatively lucky because my family is in Western Ukraine, which was relatively safe. But even in the first hours of the war, they had an airport that was just Russian troops bombed the airport there. And I felt like also it was interesting to see how different people in my family reacted to the war. And I think what is actually maybe sometimes not conveyed enough is that there's so many families like mine who are Russian, Ukrainian, and the war is doing really terrible things to these families because now there is this drift. And, a lot of Ukrainians actually now do hate Russians for a reason, but also because there's such a widespread propaganda campaign inside Russia. Some people who live in Russia who don't really have that connection, they actually don't know what's going on. Some of them truly believe there is a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, that Ukraine was about to attack Russia, and if Russian troops didn't get involved, there could have been a war once Ukraine joined NATO. So, it is really interesting because now there is such a huge drift that didn't exist before. And, I remember growing up and going to Ukraine every summer, and it was the most natural thing in the world. And now I'm afraid, I don't know when will be the next time I would be able to even go to Ukraine with my Russian passport. And it just seems like this connection that so many people had has been ruined forever.
Max, good morning or good afternoon in Istanbul. John and I are delighted to be with you virtually today to talk about the path that you've taken to get to Moscow for 10 years and the path from Moscow. So what year did you win one of our foundation scholarships?
It was 2012, so 10 years ago.
And then did we place you in the AP bureau in Moscow? Is that how that worked?
You did, yeah.
And so one thing led to another, and now you've been the Financial Times bureau chief for how long?
I've been with the FD for 6 years, but I've only been the bureau chief for about the last 6 months.
Well, welcome to the fire.
I know.
So you had to leave everything in Moscow when you fled with your family to Latvia originally. So did you leave all your worldly possessions behind, or the majority of them?
We haven't pulled out of Russia yet. We are still trying to work out exactly what this all means for us, and specifically there's this law on what they call fake news and discrediting the Russian armed forces, where you can face up to 15 years in prison for things like calling the war a war and reporting a version of events that differs in any way from what the Russian Defense Ministry says. So we and a number of other media outlets were trying to work out what this all means for us, but we are very much hoping to keep our bureau alive and to be back when we can.
So were you surprised that Putin launched this invasion, this war, or did you sense that it was coming, judging from his rhetoric?
It was kind of both. What was very strange was being a foreign correspondent, you kind of have your feet in two worlds. One is the place where you're reporting from, and the other one is the Western world. In DC, Europe, and it was real kind of distance, because it wasn't the first time in the last years in Russia where the picture that Western governments, media were painting of Russia was totally different to the impression you get on the ground. Almost no one, I can name about maybe 3 people I know
in Russia. And this includes, not just people in and around the government, but people in the expert community, people in the opposition, businessmen, diplomats. They were all convinced there was some kind of a clever trick by Putin to get things that he wanted out of the West. And of course, U.S. intelligence had such a dubious track record on things like this that no one believed it was true. Also, I think a lot of people they didn't want to believe it was true, because it's really such an epoch-defining moment. We're going to be dealing with the consequences of this for decades, whatever happens on a battlefield. And I think people didn't really want to know what was happening. But starting I think towards the end of December, I had a few slightly scary conversations with people, and Russia started making these strange threats, demanding negotiations in public on things that they weren't going to make any concessions on. Making these impossible ultimatums. It was clear that they had some sort of ulterior motive. We just didn't know what it was. And what was really remarkable is it turned out that most of the people working for Putin, even they didn't know exactly what he was going to do. And as far as I know, many of them were as surprised as we were when it finally happened.
Where does it go? You mentioned that this is going to play out for decades. It's going to be a long, long time before we really get any clarity. Is that what you seem to be suggesting?
Well, Ukraine and some of Ukraine's Western supporters, they suspect that by May 9th, Victory Day, Putin wants to declare victory in some way, have a big parade on Red Square, like they always do, and so that's why they want to make as many gains on the ground now as they can, reach some sort of political sentiment. But even if you look at the peace process, the peace process as described by Zelensky, which is going to involve a referendum, constitutional changes, is going to take at least a year. And more importantly, I think the global balance of power of the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been completely upended. We are back into a world of great power conflict. The idea that globalization was going to flatten everything out and bring about the end of history, as some people call it, that age is absolutely over. The world is really divided over this. You have Ukraine and its mostly Western supporters against the likes of China and India, who have tacitly supported what Russia is doing, and at the very least not condemned it. Some countries in the Gulf states, and this is going to affect absolutely everything, because it's the first time that there have been sanctions of this magnitude against a country as important to the global economy as Russia. Russia is one of the world's biggest oil and gas producers, and Europe is going to have to find a way to end its energy dependency on Russia. Russia and Ukraine are two of the world's biggest wheat exporters. This is going to create a global food crisis. It essentially has already. We're right in the middle of what's supposed to be planting season, and in Ukraine, a lot of farmers can't do that right now. And yeah, it's completely ripped up the global order, which Russia has basically said. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said this today, that one of the reasons they did this was because they wanted to end U.S. domination of the world as they see it. So yeah, I think whatever happens, we're going to be dealing with the after effects of this for a long time. This is the biggest land conflict in Europe since 1945.
Valerie, tell us the quick trajectory, the quick story of how you went from being an OPC Foundation winner to being a war correspondent for the New York Times, covering the planet's biggest story.
Wow. Well, I graduated from Columbia in 2013 and was lucky enough to become an OPC fellow, a fellowship to go and work in the Balkans, actually with Reuters in their Belgrade bureau. And after my time at Reuters finished, I actually continued to work in the Balkans. I spent 4 years then in Kosovo, and then I continued to cover the region for the Financial Times. I was based out of Budapest, but I was covering Hungary, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, and the whole former Yugoslavia, where I had previously lived also before my time at Columbia. And yeah, it was a great experience to be an OPC fellow, to have the support of the network that I still have, and of the donor that I still have. And I think that extra time that I spent in the Balkans as part of that fellowship was very helpful for me, just to boost my regional knowledge, to be able to do something that I wouldn't have been able to do, as a young reporter without without my own trust fund, I guess. So that helped me quite a lot. And then I started for the New York Times in May of last year, and finally moved to Moscow only in August, actually, not expecting to become or wanting to become a war correspondent. But, already just a few months later, sort of the war drums began beating. And I remember we sat around a table in our bureau where the New York Times has operated for more than 100 years, actually, and discussed, things are starting to look really bad. The troop buildup looks really bad. And we tried on our flak jackets, thinking that, hoping that we wouldn't need to be using them. But then, things started getting even worse. And on Valentine's Day, I was on a flight with that same flak jacket to Kyiv, where I spent, where I was for the beginning of the war, which we all sort of realized the night before it happened was going to happen. And then I've spent,
How did you know that was going to happen?
Well, it's interesting. I actually, in Kyiv, people did not expect it to happen. Even the day before, they were denying that this could ever happen. But I remembered, the first place I ever worked as a journalist was Sarajevo. And all of my friends from Bosnia would say, even as we watched the war beginning in Croatia, even as we saw nationalism growing ever more rampant in Serbia, and, saw alarming signs here, nobody believed it could happen until it did. And that was always in the back of my mind, actually, while I was in Kyiv, even as I was also hoping against hope that it was just hype. But, the Putin speech, the Security Council meeting, the cyber attacks that all now seem actually like distant memories that were only about a month and a half ago. And then in the end, the night before it happened, there was some intelligence going around that it would happen in the middle of the night, or before dawn broke. And, I gathered some of my friends who hadn't heard that and sort of told them we all packed a little bag for ourselves, to, all the essential items that we might need in case we lost communications, in case we couldn't find food, something like that. In the end, thankfully, the strike on Kyiv was quite drastic, but we were all safe and fine at that point.
What was the moment of greatest danger did you feel altogether you were in Ukraine for a month, 6 weeks?
I think 6 or 7 weeks, and I'm going back. Actually, for me, the biggest danger was actually right before the war, right before the all-out escalation began. So I had actually gone on the 19th of February to the front line in the East. I mean, most people really expected that if something really big were to happen, it would be happening in the East. So, many of my colleagues had gone out there to base, and I embedded for a day with the Ukrainian military and with some politicians to go to the East, because before the attacks in Kyiv and Kharkiv and other cities began, there was sort of 2-3 days of like very intense, sustained, heavy shelling along the line of contact, which, had been relatively, before that, kind of smoldering. There might be an exchange of fire here and there, but it sort of began, exactly as American intelligence was saying it would, possibly with an eye to provoking a false flag attack, or, provoking the Ukrainians into responding. And I went to the town of Svitlodarsk, which is home to a very important chemical processing facility and energy plant. And David Arahamia, who is the faction leader in the Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, from Zelensky's party, organized just maybe a handful of journalists to go to a site. This was, 2-3 in the afternoon. And we organized to go to a site that had been shelled at 11 a.m. that day. And we went there. It was just kind of a small military outpost, probably one of the closest to the other side, which was Horlivka, where like Russian troops were stationed there, and we sort of spent about 5-10 minutes interviewing the local station commander, talking to him about the casualties that were sustained. One of the men who was hit needed to have his arm amputated. My photographer colleague Lindsay Adario showed up, and then all of a sudden we just got this time to go, we need to get out of here. And I think pretty much just as we had packed into the car and pulled out, 3-4 seconds later, we could hear them lobbing mortars at us. They were very close to us. So that was the first real brush that I had in this war, and I think the closest that I've come really to being in harm's way. And I mean, we were being driven by a soldier in the Ukrainian army who drove very well. He had spent 8 years actually on this part of the front and knew the road very potholed road very well. And he kind of just kept saying, everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. Don't freak out. We're getting out of here. He was so calm. Yeah. And then we pulled into a kind of, I don't know, an outpost, maybe 1-2 kilometers away. And we waited for the shelling to stop, and then we left. We went.
Sorry, go.
Oh no, I was just going to say that we went by bus to Kramatorsk, which is the city that today was shelled. The train station was shelled, killing, I don't know, at least 20-30 people who were trying to flee the city because the Ukrainian government ordered mass evacuation. Since now that the initial phase of Russia's operation failed to take Kiev and some of these other cities, they seem to be regrouping towards the east, and yeah.
You wrote a piece about Mariupol. It was very graphic. While you were in Lviv, I think you were in the West. Are you able to do a lot of reporting on social media, or is it on telephone, or how are you able to get such graphic and compelling detail from a distance?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, unfortunately, it was really impossible to get into Mariupol, and it was very hard to find out what was going on because even, the city government, many of those officials are not inside the city, and they're getting information, from second and third hand sources. What I tried to do was find as many people as possible who had recently left, with incredibly graphic, incredibly fresh, incredibly painful memories. And I was speaking to them by video chat, by phone call, on Telegram, and I would speak to them, I would say probably for an hour and a half each person. And I think for them, everything was so fresh and had just happened, and they hadn't spoken to anybody besides the people around them about it. And, these words and images sort of tumbled out of them. Wow. And I was very glad that they were able and willing to share their story with me. And I mean, many of the people that I spoke to said that this is very hard and very painful, but the world needs to know, because when you're sitting there in the basement, when you are huddled alone with no electricity, no contact with the outside world, you feel like you're abandoned, that nobody knows that you're there, that it's almost as if you don't exist. And so it was very important to me to be able to put their stories on the front page of the New York Times and to tell them that we do very much care, and we do know you exist, and we want you to live and thrive.
Wow, how powerful. John,
that kind of reporting does bring change eventually. My only question is, are you taking care of yourself, and are your colleagues taking care of themselves?
Well, I feel very, very blessed to, be a full-time staffer at the New York Times and have my editors and people around us actually really caring and inquiring every day and having a very supportive community. Wars are often covered by a lot of freelancers. And, when I was encouraged to take a break, other friends and colleagues of mine sort of said, well, that's nice for you. Like, I'm a freelancer. I can't do that. Just even logistically getting in and out of the country takes time and money. And so from that, the paper has been very supportive in terms of, the editors calling to check in, especially after I had this incident with a mortar fire at the beginning before the full-scale invasion started. Yes, I feel very blessed that the editors are checking in all the time and very genuinely concerned. And we have so many foreign correspondents in our network that can come in as well and replace colleagues who take a break or who leave, and then sort of get some rest and come back, because it was really it's difficult to. Yeah, I mean, you're working nonstop. There's so much more to cover than you can even cover in a day in a region. So I'm very grateful that they encouraged me to have a small break.
Wonderful, Valerie. Thank you so much. I'm personally very touched that you were willing to do this and be so articulate and so convincing.
Thank you.
Now, Valerie was speaking from Cyprus, where she was on R&R. This segment was edited down from a longer version, which will now be posted to the OPC YouTube channel. The link is in the chat there. You see it right now. We've also been in touch with Juan Arredondo, who won the Harper Scholarship at the OPC Foundation luncheon in 2020. As most of you know, he was shot in Kyiv while documenting the flight of refugees for Time magazine. He survived, but his friend and colleague did not. Juan is back in the United States recovering from his wounds, and we reached out to him. In his great humility, he thanked us for what we had done and asked to send his best wishes to this year's winners. Lastly, my personal thanks to everyone involved in supporting our foundation. Our board is remarkably strong and passionate about this cause. Most governors took part in judging, and 4 of them provided media training to help our winners prepare for today. Jane Riley and Kat Riley have held our program together with great conviction and indeed courage. Chad Bouchard has been our behind-the-scenes technological guru as usual. We'll be having a physical in-person reception on May 19th in Manhattan for our friends and for past and present winners. Let Jane and Kat know if you wish to attend, if you haven't already signed up. So we hope to return to an in-person luncheon at the Yale Club in February 2023. Wouldn't that be lovely? We've already booked it. Thanks to the efforts of so many people, the OPC Foundation is alive and well. I regard it as something of a miracle. Goodbye for now.